So, welcome, Tim. Thank you for being here with us.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited to your annual gathering to share valuable information to promote security and resilience in our communities. So, thank you, George, for the introduction. My name is Tim Rudin, as George mentioned. I serve as the Training and Exercise Coordinator for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, Region 8, which is our Rocky Mountain, covers the Rocky Mountain area, including Colorado, Montana, the Dakotas, Utah, and Wyoming. With me today is our Regional External Affairs Officer, Carol Lamb. She's sitting back there to help answer questions and things that might come up during the course of the session today. But it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm here today to talk about physical security considerations and active shooter planning and preparedness. This can be a difficult area to address. It's important, though, to dedicate time and resources to this to ensure we're adequately prepared to respond and recover from this type of event. No matter our position, what organization that we're a part of, anyone can play an integral role in mitigating the impacts of an active shooter incident. We'll focus on that today, but this can be applied to a broad range of types of incidents as we get into the planning aspects. CISA works to enhance preparedness through a whole community approach. We have many products, tools, and resources. We have some handouts available up here, in addition to the presentation, which I believe will be available and has some links in there that you can follow up with later on. And also, if you go to CISA.gov, you can search and find a wide array of resources and things to reference as you have time following this event. You know, it's reassuring to see you all embracing this effort to improve preparedness against potential threats. And this presentation is a great first step to get you on that process of, on the way to reinforce any initiatives you may already have in progress, or it's a good place to start. There are many factors that are to be considered as we go through this the planning and preparedness aspects. When you're looking at security enhancements, I'll talk some options to consider as we go throughout the morning here. We'll walk through some of those today and hopefully leave you with a framework for you to plan and prepare for different threats that you might face in the different areas in which you work in and where your communities are. We'll review different threats with a focus on active shooter, as I mentioned. We'll talk vulnerability assessments, ways to identify some risks that you may not have considered before, but things that you should take into account as you go through a planning effort for your particular area. Then we'll look into some steps for creating how you start building an emergency action plan, where to begin, what are the elements you should include, and then I'll talk then an overview of some personal security considerations, as well as wrap up then with some non-confrontational de-escalation techniques if you find yourself or your employees or counterparts in a situation where you may be dealing with some agitated members or people that you need to deal with. So we'll talk some techniques to help maintain a safe and secure environment for you, and as we look at this throughout the day. Quick disclaimer about the presentation. These are options for consideration. It's not directive in nature. Keep in mind that these elements we discuss, it's produced by CISA, but provided to you to help stakeholders and critical infrastructure owners and operators recognize violent situations and how to deal with them. Reporting can become an interesting area. We realize there are some elements that can be protected under the Constitution and what to identify, so we want to make sure that you clearly identify that this is likely an element that may be leading towards an act of violence, and then consider and weigh the factors before you then report on certain things. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. The overall goals for today, whether it's individuals, organizations, our communities as a whole, we want to be able to understand more about the threats and hazards that we face so that we can then work to prevent them if at all possible, prepare for them if they do end up happening, and then respond and recover in a way that's helpful and healthy for your community, and be able to tackle this situation, move on, and then continue with your mission, whatever that might be. This presentation, as I mentioned, provides a good framework for development of a response plan. It is important that everybody in your organization in some way is familiar with the response and how you plan to respond, what's in the plan, because everybody can play a role in that aspect. Many of the topics we cover today can be applied not just in the workplace or houses of worship directly, but also in other aspects of your life. Whether you're at a shopping mall, school campus, you're at a restaurant, an entertainment venue of some sort. A lot of these elements and the personal security considerations and these things can be applied across the board in any area. So keep that in mind. Preparedness and awareness are key no matter where you are. And I encourage you to reference the slides that are available, like I mentioned, read those going forward, look at some of those resources. Feel free to take notes. Give yourself some action items today to take forward and address, not only prepare yourself and your workplace, but also your friends and family. We'll first review some common threat vectors, which are the paths or the means to which an assailant may follow in order to attack or exploit some sort of vulnerability that may be in place. In particular, we're talking public spaces and gathering locations. This list changes, it expands. This is a good starting point to look at as we talk about potential threats to public facilities. They're generally categorized into these following areas. For the most part, they're pretty self-explanatory. We'll first focus, like I mentioned, on active shooter. This is the most common method of attack we hear about, involving the use of firearms. An example would be an attack in a public area on individuals or an individual, some sort of an assailant performing an attack in that environment. Vehicle rammings. This is where a vehicle can be used as a weapon in some form of environment to a crowd, a gathering of some sort, and these can have really severe impacts. Whether it's at a parade, some sort of march, or an event or a gathering of some sort where a vehicle can be used as a threat. Next, we have insider threats, and this can apply through an intentional act. It could be deliberate, purposeful attack by somebody who's internal to your organization. It could be through active carelessness, whether it's a password left written down that allows then someone access. So you're talking on the cyber side of things, where someone can get access to a network. Insider threats could be beyond just the physical security side, but can involve people that are known to your organization. It could be family members or friends or somebody else that may have a grievance against your particular organization. Edged weapon attacks, knives, things like that, they can be involved primarily in areas where maybe firearms aren't as readily available. These types of weapons, of course, are easily accessible. We talk about improvised explosive devices, typically not extremely common in the types of attacks we see here locally. However, when you look at acts of terrorism, that's used in about 50% of those types of events. Fire as a weapon is another area where devices such as Molotov cocktails or incendiary devices can be used to inflict damage on a facility or a group of people, those sort of things. And some of the more newer emerging aspects of threats are small unmanned aircraft systems or drones. We call them SUAS or UAS. You may hear it referenced as a lot of different things. Very common now, getting more prevalent across different events, and a lot of times, of course, used in a non-harmful manner. But they can be modified. They can be used to do surveillance. They can be used to have weapons or even explosives too. And that's becoming more of a threat. They're hard to track. They're hard to monitor. They're hard to determine who's operating them, where they're coming from. So this is a very difficult problem to face, but something to consider in planning, in particular if you have larger open venue events or things where you're concerned about security and surveillance that could take place. And lastly, complex coordinated attacks. These are your events where it may occur in multiple locations, a coordinated event, multiple assailants trying to inflict fear, harm, and violence on multiple areas at once, large groups of people. Of course, examples of that would be September 11th or the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing attacks. All right, before we delve into the rest of the presentation, I want to define what we're talking about when we say active shooter. Keep in mind that the planning and preparedness aspects for active shooter translates into preparedness for other threat vectors as well that I mentioned. We're going to focus on active shooter today, but this can be applied across the board to your preparedness against many different types of potential risks that you have. So for the definition we're looking at for active shooter today, an individual engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a populated area, often no pattern or method to their selection of victims. But keep in mind, they usually use firearms, but that's not always the case. We've listed some other threat vectors that they may use, the knives, edged weapons, explosives that could be used as part of that. Most of the shootings that happen are not classified as active shooter events. We've got criminal acts, different things, terrorism, domestic violence that aren't categorized in these active shooter events. And I'll talk some statistics in a moment. And those very clearly apply this definition to. But some active shooter incidents may start as a domestic violence or a criminal act that then spills over and develops into a larger incident that then now becomes an active shooter type of an incident. Some recent trends to provide us some context as we go forward and why we're doing this planning effort and why it's so important. These statistics from the FBI looking at a 5-year period from 2017 up through 2021, they show a dramatic increase in numbers of events. When you look at the jump up in 2020 to 2021, you have nearly over a 50% increase from 2020 and almost 100% from 2017 as you get to 2021. So that's significant. That's a big difference. The trend is not leveling out. As you can see, it continues to be a problem and something that we need to face. The number of incidents and the impacts, as you look at numbers killed in 2021, of the 61 shootings, 103 people were killed with over 140 wounded. And that's very, very important to keep in mind as we look forward and why we plan and why we look forward to trying to prevent these things from happening. Locations, it's also important to understand where they're happening. As you can see by this chart, I don't know if you can read all that, but we've got listed the largest categories: commercial facilities, then educational facilities, government properties, open spaces, some in residences, houses of worship, healthcare facilities. They're happening all over the place. And wherever you are, and whatever time of day, you just don't know when that's going to happen. So the preparedness aspects and awareness of what's going on around you is important. So with that background and talking about where they're happening, how often, let's take a moment. We'll start discussing active shooter prevention and planning. So what can we do about these things? Well, one of the most effective tools to prevent a violent incident within an organization is to train employees and associates to recognize behaviors on what is known, and you'll hear me talk about, as the pathway to violence. By instilling a positive culture of reporting incidents or suspicious behaviors, your organization may be in a better position to intervene, provide assistance to someone that might be on a pathway to violence, and act before they get to that act of violence culmination. It's also important for organizations to have an ability to react to incidents that are reported. What are you going to do with that information? Because without that action, you're not necessarily going to prevent an incident from happening. So it's great to have that reporting, but make sure you have a system in place that can do something with that information that's collected. to be able to intervene in a helpful manner to set that person on the right path or help them out in a way that prevents that from escalating to a violent incident. An active shooter isn't normally triggered by a single incident or event. There are many factors that can contribute to their situation or impact them on that pathway to violence and spark that thought of and action, whether it's homicidal or violence in some form or manner that impacts an organization. Initiators can come from family, at home, the workplace, things in the community. They can be related to religion or ideology. It could be financial impacts in their life. Other things related to their health and wellness. A lot of factors can contribute to that overall incident or person's way they focus and what they're looking forward to and how their thought process is developed. You're looking at the past few years and what's happened with COVID-19, it's brought a lot of disruption to everyone's life in a lot of these different aspects. But for most people, they don't progress from those initiators to a violent act. And that's why it's important, if you can recognize changes in those people that you know and work with, you may be able to intervene and start helping them out in a way to avoid that continuation along the pathway to violence, which I'll talk more detail next. Hard to read the specifics on the slide. I'll talk through them as I go through, but I mentioned the pathway to violence. Here's a little more in-depth look with this graphic, which displays different steps and how they can build up to a violent incident. We start on the left, the bottom part, with a grievance. Most of us have a grievance at some point in our life. Some area that bothers us, it's an issue, whether it's at home, it's a workplace, it's something that we stew about, we may have an issue with that is bothering us. But the majority of the people work through these grievances. We resolve them, we move on, we find ways to cope. Others can't do that very well. They don't have a good mechanism to deal with that. And they may progress to these next steps, this violent ideation. These thoughts are developing in their mind about possibly performing some act of violence. Many of the active shooter incidents, when we look back and study what's happened in this person's past, a lot of times they have multiple grievances they may be dealing with that compound and build, and they just don't have an effective way to healthily deal with, and they progress then along to the next steps. Beyond violent ideation, they get into even the research and planning stage. And typically, these don't always have to happen in this exact order, but typically as they progress, these happen more and more rapidly, and that it starts to spin pretty quickly to where then you get into this pre-attack preparation and probing and breaching, ultimately leading to that actual attack. There's many opportunities along this way, some identifiers that can help cue us in on potential, someone potentially on this pathway, and something that we need to keep in mind. You have a program or a system in place to report behaviors that may be indicative of some of these items along this pathway. So now we've looked at threats. We've identified some indicators of potential violence. How can you prepare and mitigate the potential threats? We'll talk a little bit about that next. Well, we'll start with a deliberate process to either develop a plan or strengthen the plans you already have in place for your organization. You want to evaluate what you currently have, whether it's existing protective measures you have in place around a facility or your organization, and then do they adequately cover against the expected risks that you have? And we'll talk a little more detail about how to assess what risks you might have, and that involves you doing a vulnerability assessment and some items like that that can help guide you through that process. We want to assess those risks. We make a determination of mitigation measures to address those different risks that we see as possible for our facilities and our organizations. and then implement some sort of steps or security measures to mitigate that. Let's now take a closer look then at the planning process itself. So how do we then prepare for those type of incidents? Busy chart here, multiple steps here, but as we're looking at how we create an emergency action plan, there's a good process to follow, starting with forming a multidisciplinary planning team. So get the right people together that can make decisions that can impact the process that you follow, and lay that foundation, that security mitigation framework that can help you then justify whether it's financial aspects or the money involved with implementing some of those measures later on. So you start with that good solid framework. It'll help you down the path. Next, conducting a risk assessment in step 2. That's the process. You want to collect information and assign values to those risks, weigh where you see as the potential risks that could impact your particular location, facility, what it might be. And that's going to help inform your priorities. Where are you going to prioritize your efforts? You want to develop different courses of action potentially. You may not have one particular way of handling that. You may identify multiple that you then have to evaluate and choose, and that's going to help you in your decision-making process going forward. You're going to determine and develop clear objectives and goals. What do you want to end up with when you're done? A written plan, something that can be implemented, trained to, and things like that occur in these next steps, which include drafting and approving that plan, making it a formal and written down plan that can be shared then across the organization for familiarity and ensuring everybody can participate in that. That's a part of your organization. Finally, you need to train your stakeholders, train those that are involved, especially those that play an active role in those particular plans, so they understand the actions they need to take. And exercise it. If you have the opportunity to actually walk through an event, whether it's just talking it through or, no kidding, more of a drill to move and take action and practice where you're going to go. How do you leave a room? Where do you go if you're going to hide? Where do you go if you're going to evacuate? Those sort of things are important to get those muscle movements down so that it's familiar. And review that, take lessons learned out of those tests, revise your plan, and start that cycle all over again. But once you get through that initial effort of setting that foundation and getting a plan in place, it then becomes part of your normal activity and process throughout the years to reevaluate, make updates, adjustments, if you add new facilities and things like that. That's going to be helpful as you go forward. And something that's important to include in here are the recovery aspects. We don't often get to that when we test and exercise and things like that. A lot of times it's that initial act. Okay, what do we do to initially respond? But there's a huge, important aspect that needs to be addressed is that recovery part. How do we ensure the mental health side of things are taken care of for our community, and that's addressed going forward, and how to manage the aftermath of these very traumatic events that occur. So have considerations in mind and include in your plan of where do you go for help. Do you have that organically? Is it part of your organization? Do you have resources in the community that you can reach out to, that you work with, that you can point people to as a recovery, as you work through that recovery?
And where would that be in the steps that are on screen for the recovery plan part?
Well, recovery is not specifically outlined here on this part of the plan. It's just something I mentioned as it's important to keep in mind as you go through.
Okay.
And there's a lot of great tools and learning tools that are out there, even on CISA.gov. As you look at some of our active shooter preparedness trainings we offer, go a little more in depth on that recovery side, and there's some case examples and people to talk from different experiences they've gone through and how important that is to help go through those processes. Something that's been developed by CISA initially for houses of worship specifically is where it started. It was a self-assessment tool, and it's available on CISA.gov, and it's a great way. It's a free tool. It helps you perform a security self-assessment. It's designed to guide you through and understanding vulnerabilities. This is just one example of one of the set of questions that it'll lead you through. It identifies options for considerations as you move forward to mitigate those different vulnerabilities that are listed. It's the first step in building an effective security program. It's not intended to be an in-depth, all-in-one security assessment. It's just one step in that whole process to enhance security. But it's a great place to start, and as I mentioned, even though it was developed for houses of worship, it can apply to different types of facilities, whether you're looking at businesses or schools or different types of locations. So after you go through that process, you work through that self-assessment, you address those preliminary findings, you may consider following on with more detailed assessments. This is something where CISA representatives may be able to assist you. We have field representatives that deal with protective security and can assist doing assessments on site in your different facilities to help you with that more in-depth review. The results may also help you prioritize your different security measures you may consider implementing. And the investments, where are you going to put those limited dollars to help make change and to help you along that process for ensuring safety. All right, so protective measures can include a variety of actions and procedures that can enhance the security posture overall of your facility. On the next few slides, I've got listed several cost-effective measures to consider. I won't read through them all, but remember, it's always best to use a layered approach. And what I mean by that is use physical security components along with procedural and information-driven. So what does that mean? For procedural, access controls, credentialing, those type of things. Insider threat program, I mentioned that as a potential threat vector. Having a program to identify potential risks from an insider and what to do with that. Others, business continuity. So you have an event, how do you continue operating while you're going through a significant event that's going on? The physical, pretty straightforward, fencing, lighting, locks, intrusion detection systems, alarms, those sort of things that you're looking for to help enhance that physical security.
What was the third one? Physical, procedural, and...
Information-driven, and I was about to hit on that. So these are things like know who your neighbors are, communicate with those in your community, those around you, sharing information, being able to talk to them about some things maybe they saw as a security risk, some attempted intrusion in their facility, maybe some type of activity that's suspicious that they could share with their neighborhood folks. Establish and maintain a liaison with your local first responders, law enforcement, EMS, those that are part of a response to an event that may take place on your premises. Establish those relationships before an incident happens so they're familiar. Where do they go? How do they access? You may have locked doors or access control to certain parts of the facility. They understand better if they've been there, they know who to talk to, who your security personnel are. That's going to help a lot rather than trying to be reactive day of an event. Never being there, never seeing where and how things are laid out, maybe some threats or hazardous materials, chemicals, not necessarily in your facilities, but in general we talk about having that awareness, a liaison with the local first responders and things like that. And they can help connect you with your state fusion centers. There's information sharing networks that are out there. Each state has a fusion center that helps share intelligence and threats and potential aspects, whether it's towards houses of worship or different aspects of your community. You can get on lists of shared distribution of threats and materials that may be applicable to your particular instance. So working through your law enforcement contacts to help ensure you're getting that information shared with you is another way to then take that back, maybe make changes to how you operate or deal with customers or patrons or people that may be coming into your facilities. Does that help answer your question? So that physical, procedural, and the information-driven are all aspects that you want to keep in mind. can reference it on the slides that are provided, the PDF version. We have many resources to assist in the planning process. There's a one geared specifically towards houses of worship, mitigating attacks on houses of worship security guide. We have an active shooter emergency action plan template that helps walk you through some of the questions that you want to ask as you go through that process. And for a more in-depth look just at emergency action plans, you can join me for a virtual emergency action plan workshop that I'm conducting as a webinar on March 21st. If you're interested, I've got my email at the end of the slide deck that you can send, and I can share the invite for you. You can register. Again, that's a virtual. We're going to spend about an hour going through a little more in-depth at those different steps along the way to developing an emergency action plan. You've got additional tools and resources via links on the right side of that slide. They can help you develop those response plans for your particular organization. Now that we've reviewed how to plan for security needs and we've looked at how to prepare for emergency, let's talk about how you translate those plans into action. Well, the same thing applies to pretty much anything we've always learned. First, you call 911, right? You want to make sure you then have your emergency action plan in place. You need to implement that. You need to make sure you follow the steps that you've outlined, or at least that you have established and that people know. And it's important, again, why you go back to that training and that exercising of it. So no matter who's on staff, who's there, when it happens, you can take action and perform any actions that you may need to do. And keep that in mind that a lot of different facilities have a lot of different considerations to take into account. Not everyone is in a workplace where it's always the same people there all the time, every day. We have people doing telework. We have people that aren't from your organization that might be visiting. There are volunteers that are coming through, transiting. We need to take care of them as well. If they're on site but they don't know your plan, somebody's got to guide them in the right action to take, where to go, what they need to do to help keep themselves safe, and what you're doing as an organization. So keep in mind things like access and functional needs. How do you take care of those that don't have the same capabilities as everyone else? They may have some limitations that you need to account for, whether that's a physical or some other sort of condition that prevents them from being able to react as quickly or in a way that they may have, they may need some assistance to do so. Keep that in mind. All right. So we've talked about individuals within your organization that may be a threat. You might be able to identify them in advance. You're around them. You see them on a pathway to violence. But it's also important that we address individuals who may pose a threat that may be unfamiliar to you. They may not be part of your organization. They're external to whatever group you have, and they just show up at a facility. How do you then deal with those type of people in your community? Well, first, we're going to look at some personal security considerations, including behavioral indicators to keep in mind, and then we'll then take that on to some non-confrontational de-escalation techniques and things to consider as you're interacting with those persons. Ultimately, we want to keep your site, your location, your community safe and secure. So these will help you walk through that. Some behavioral indicators. I won't read through them all, but these are potential to be displayed or observed by somebody that's a potential security concern. So obviously, someone who implies threat to violence, that's pretty easy. But some of these are just something to investigate further. And it may not be a single type of behavior that means, okay, it's an impending act of violence, but in totality, that holistic view, keep that in mind. And that's where it's important to have that culture of reporting. You may have somebody identify someone saying something, but the next person sees the same person doing something. The next person sees them trying to enter a restricted area. Piecing it all together, having a good place to report, can then get that full picture of that this is no kidding a threat. We need to now take that to the next step, whether it's bringing in law enforcement, doing some sort of defined action in your plan. But it's important to understand what lays behind all this And that culture of security awareness and reporting is going to help you on that process. And not just having the reporting side, but then what do you do with it? How do you take action? Have that spelled out in your plan for where to go with that and how it's handled and who's responsible for taking that into the next step in the process. So I think it's really important to reemphasize there, encourage that reporting of suspicious activities as part of your overall security posture. In the next 2 slides, we're going to highlight a number of personal security measures. So how do you take care of yourself to help mitigate potential threats that could be impending harm towards you individually? I'll highlight a few. I'll let you read through them. But whether it's what you share online, limiting the amount of personal information that's out there to the public. You're going somewhere, let a trusted person know where you're going, when you expect to return, so they can quickly follow up if you're not heard from and there's an incident. This is all something to consider and keep in mind. Changing your routines. Don't be predictable, especially if you're in a position of leadership in the community that somebody may have an intent to target you. If you remain unpredictable, it makes it a little bit harder to take action and potentially be a threat against you personally. Some additional items to consider. Again, these are just options for consideration, but good things to keep in mind as you look to protect yourself. You see something looks suspicious, report it. Don't go mess with it. Don't go to an unattended package, but it's something to keep in mind and identify that. You're not necessarily the one to evaluate what the condition is, but if it looks suspicious, go ahead and report it. Choosing where you park, well-lit areas, how you handle that, especially in an area you're not familiar with. Trying to take care of yourself is very important. So keep that in mind as you look to prevent any kind of harm from coming to yourself. Okay. The next series of slides, as I mentioned, we're going to talk some non-confrontational techniques. So these will help secure your facilities, things, way to help your organizations handle these types of things that may present to your organization. This is going to include something we call the power of hello, as well as techniques for de-escalation. And these are important for your staff to know, those especially that routinely interact with community members, customers, those that may be the general public, or those that you're not necessarily familiar with. So we'll take some time to go through a few of those areas and give you some techniques to think about. So non-confrontational techniques, as I mentioned, they augment your existing security framework. So these are steps you can take beyond those traditional protective measures. They position your employees, your volunteers, if they have this information handy and are trained to some of these things out there to help them be in a better position to identify suspicious behavior and potentially thwart a potential attack should it be in the process of developing. The non-confrontational techniques that we'll talk about, as I mentioned, the power of hello and the CISA de-escalation series. You can find out more products for each of these and more details on CISA.gov. And that's something that we'll delve into, this particular steps of these series coming up next. So power of hello, it's a 4-step approach for determining someone's purpose. They're unknown, they're at your facility, trying to determine why are they there. Houses of worship, other related community venues, by their nature, public-oriented, they're open, inviting. In a lot of cases, they may then appear as an attractive target because of that perceived lower security, potentially, whether that's true or not. That just still might be an area where somebody perceives as a target. Faith-based organizations and related facilities may be a potential target because of these elements that are seen by a potential threat or threat actor as somewhere where they could then perform an act of violence. This is also known, so power of hello is also known as the oh no approach, and that spells it out: observe, initiate a hello, navigate the risk, and obtain help. We're going to talk about the specific steps in the next few slides. Starting with observe. Now, we talked some of these suspicious behaviors already. I'm not going to read through them all again, but it's an important reminder that, remember, everybody in the workplace can play a role and contribute to enhancing security by being in a position and understanding how to report something that's suspicious, being aware of their surroundings, what's going on in their particular facility, to be able to determine something's out of place. So that's important to keep in mind. Knowing what belongs and what doesn't, that all comes to play of being able to then determine, hey, this isn't right, let me take this to the next step. And then be able to continue that process to be able to potentially identify and act before it actually manifests into a violent incident. So initiating a hello, acknowledging that, keeping in mind that safety, of course, is the most important aspect here. So if you feel there's an immediate threat, don't wait, try to investigate further, call 911, do your reporting mechanisms the way you need to. But if you're able to intervene or engage somebody, just simply asking or saying hello can be a good way to start a conversation to then get a better understanding of, hey, what's their purpose here? You may look out of place. They may be legitimately just looking for some help, or they're lost or whatnot, but there may be something more to it. So initiating that hello can help prompt that conversation. And then and considering some of these phrases on the slide to give them the opening to start that conversation that can then proceed along and identify better what's their purpose for being there. Again, approaching an unknown person, there could be some risks associated with that. You're going to have to weigh what you assess as what's going on there, and if it's not something that you want to engage with, that's okay. But if it's suspicious and appears to be a threat, know who and where to report that to be able to continue along that process. So navigating the risk. Here's a little more in depth about looking at, is this truly suspicious behavior? What are you seeing and hearing? And some questions that you ask yourself. Is this a legitimate patron? Are they here for a true purpose? Do they know where they're at? Is what they're doing? Are there any suspicious activities around the security mechanisms in place? Do they look like they're avoiding it? Are they dressed out of place, potentially hiding weapons? Things like that, all that you can navigate through, and even the types of questions that they may be asking. Is that right for the situation? Are they looking and asking questions that just aren't appropriate for somebody coming off the street or a community member that they should be asking about with your particular security and those sort of things about your facility? And is there a feeling of being threatened? If that's the case, separate yourself from the area. Maybe try to keep an eye on that person while you call 911 or report that via whatever means you have in place at your facility. Obtaining help. Obviously, we can do the 911 route, have that clear connection with who to report to, how to get a hold of, whether it's first responders, security personnel, management, whatever the process you have in place, and that's where we go back to that planning aspect. Identify who to report, where that goes, how that process continues so that you can get a situation taken care of, and be prepared to provide that who, what, where, when, why, as much detail as you can, so that that can help out any kind of emergency response or security response that's taking place. And that's why it's important, like I mentioned earlier, if you already have that relationship established with your local law enforcement, emergency responders, and they can understand when you describe what's happening, they may be able to better be positioned when they do respond to handle the situation that they walk in on. So after going through the oh no or the power of hello, let's now transition to some de-escalation techniques. And that'll be the final segment we talk about today, and then we'll have a chance to ask some more questions and talk about some of this in a little more in depth if you're interested. So the CISA provides a thorough series of de-escalation products that include 4 products. They're separate but related, and you can dig further into each of these on CISA.gov. They can be used as a series, they can be used as standalone references, and they guide you through a sequence of actions to take and how to make decisions related to being potentially confronted with a violent situation. So there's a list of examples of potential stressors, behavior changes that we kind of talked about already, physical behaviors, potential warning signs of an escalating incident, some things to keep in mind. Remember, they're not intended to be taken as a single indicator, but looking at that situation overall, a holistic view, and being able to blend that together and then assess what's really going on in the situation. That's particular circumstance and what's happening. So we'll begin looking at the recognize aspect. Again, we want to emphasize that everybody could be in a position to play some role in this. So being able to report, being able to assess what's going on is very important, whether it's your coworkers, friends, family at the location, that they all understand what the norm is for that position. They all are positioned to identify some sort of early warning signs that could be taking place at a particular facility. These behaviors, indicators, things that you notice changes to, and then it talks about some physical behavior indicators that can be identified as potentially leading to an escalating situation. Things to, as simple as how they are standing, balled fists, clenched jaw, up to, of course, you visibly see a weapon and things like that. But just things to consider that can be combined and brought together, that overall view to determine, hey, this is not necessarily going in the right direction, let's start to be concerned by recognizing, and then be prepared to report any of that suspicious activity as soon as possible to do so. Okay, assessing. We talked a little bit about this already. Here's some early warning signs and then signs of impending or imminent danger. Thinking about, of course, the person that may be of concern, the environment that you're in, and if there's a known stressor that's causing that. You know, maybe you can address one or multiple of those and the situation can be alleviated. The person directly, maybe you can see the stressor that's taken place and you can alleviate that, or make a change in that environment depending on the situation to help de-escalate what's going on. We've talked about threat assessments before and being able to take a person out of an incident like this and have someone experienced in conducting some form of interview or interaction to better assess, hey, what's their state of mind, what's going on here. If you're not to that impending violence, of course, you may have time to engage and ask a few more questions to determine, hey, what's going on and how do we prevent this from turning into a violent act, something like that. Ultimately, remember, we're doing these things in assessing in order to prevent and keep your facility and people safe and secure and prevent an incident from happening. A couple slides here on options to consider as far as purposeful actions and verbal communication, some techniques and things to consider. Instead of saying, a certain way, consider an alternate way of phrasing the question that's not as confrontational. Gives them the opportunity to share and be open about what they're experiencing and some things to keep in mind. We think of these, and a lot of times we just tend to say the first thing that enters our mind, but if we read through and plan and think these through in advance, it can help you manage a situation and prevent it from escalating. And then body language. Here's some other options to consider in how to engage someone in this particular situation that may be a potential threat. And if these techniques and the ones we talked about, the verbal on the previous slide, they're not de-escalating, things continue to advance, or that individual continues to become more agitated, that's a time to disengage calmly, be able to then separate, and then be prepared to report, whether that's, again, local, to your security team, to law enforcement, 911, whatever it may be based on what you assess as the extent of that situation right at that time. You own that behavior, you can control that situation up to a point. I mean, at some point you can't stop them potentially from what they're going to do, but you need to think about your personal safety and those around you, and be able to disengage soon enough to be able to protect yourself and those, and put you in a position to keep everyone around you safe and handle that situation. Bring in somebody who's better prepared to handle that situation. Reporting, we talked about why that's an important part of your plan, incorporating that as part of your policy so people know who to go to. Is it calling your security desk? Is it going to their manager, supervisor? What's the process? And reinforcing that. Having a way to make that clear and how that's going to happen. And again, as I mentioned, personal safety before the report is key. So that comes with that'll come with the steps, but making sure that everyone's safe before you take that time to get on the phone and report or go physically to someone else. If you're calling 911, I mean, these are pretty understandable basic premises, but think through as much detail as possible to be able to pass along. And if it's a violent situation happening, it's going to be hard to remember this. I know something that Kara, I meant to mention sooner. We've got some active shooter cards. These are great, they fit in your wallet, but it's important to read through it beforehand. Because as that's happened, that's not the time to read through, well, run, or fight. Same thing. It seems pretty, straightforward, but think it through. What kind of details do you want to pass along if you're calling 911? They're going to ask you specific questions, so thinking about these in advance, practicing. If you have someone walk in simulating a threat, the type of weapon, where the location is, the description. Some facilities are really laid out. If it's a campus of facilities, they have building numbers, they can be confusing. Being able to provide a physical address, if you're calling from a cell phone, as we know, sometimes that's not very well translated. If you can't talk, but the line's still open, they're trying to find you, there's ways to make sure you can pass along as much detail as possible. Physical locations, street names, rather than just a building number, which they may not be familiar with unless you've included them as a liaison in that emergency response as you've developed your plan. But additional things to consider. So as I wrap up the formal part of the presentation, I'll share a list of tools and resources here, a lot of information on this slide that you can follow up with at your convenience to assist you in the planning and preparedness efforts. If nothing else, you can go to CISA.gov, CISA.gov, and do searches. The new website we've got is very well set up to find. Even if you don't know the exact term, it can get you there pretty effectively. Or reach out and ask me. I've got my email coming up here on the next slide, I think. But it's important to understand that there's a lot of tools and resources available that you can use to help in your efforts to plan and promote security and resilience in your communities. I also want to highlight, even though we're focused on physical security aspects today, of course, CISA, cybersecurity, that's also a big part of what we do. So there may be some a need for resources in other areas too. To keep that in mind as you're looking for tools and resources from CISA. We have a wide range of free cybersecurity resources and services to support our cyber mission, to protect and enhance the nation's critical cyber infrastructure. And we have some handouts up here as well about some of those resources. If you're in need of those cyber resources, I can connect you with one of our cybersecurity advisors that are in your particular area. And I realize some of you aren't from the Rocky Mountain area or Colorado. I can also connect you with your regional contacts that can better assist you with your particular needs. So our region, of course, the Colorado, Dakotas, Montana, Utah, Wyoming, etc. Each of those states has their own advisors, whether it's protective physical security or cyber security or chemical security. We can connect you to the right people in your area if you're not from this particular region, so keep that in mind.
But are they as cool as you?
Well, I mean, I won't comment there.
I will
Our
region
external
8 is the
affairs.
best region, but
That's right.
Is there slide deck, like, do you all have formatted slides similarly, or is it kind of dependent on each leader to put together things like this? How consistent is this?
They're very consistent, so
Okay.
even though this isn't just
Yeah.
pulled off of our CISA.gov website, they're pulled from different presentations that I urge to talk about a couple different topics together for you today. So if you're in need of additional information about active shooter preparedness, just general hometown security, securing gatherings, or the cybersecurity resources that I mentioned, this email will get you in touch with me. My card is also on the table, and we can connect you with some additional resources. I've got a fact sheet that lays out training and exercise links and things that is also on the table there. And then I already mentioned the new CISA.gov website. Any more you want to hit on that, Kara?
I do. So Tim was explaining that we have state advisors in each of our 10 regions. Our 10 regions are broken into states and territories. And then we have cybersecurity, physical security, and chemical security advisors in each of those states. And while there's a lot of this that, as Tim explained, is pretty standardized, if you and your organization want to meet with one of our advisors, they can also help tailor all of our resources to your unique situation that you have with your facility. So we've got a lot of flexibility and a lot of information that we can share and help you as you build your resiliency with your organization.
We can't develop and write your plan for you, but we can help you along that process. There's a lot of unique aspects that we don't know, but we can help make sure you get the right people on your team, connect you with some of those local resources that you may not be familiar with, whether it's some of your law enforcement connections, whether it's local, state, emergency managers that are in the local area that you may be tied into, depending on the type of facility. If you get into emergency, there may be folks that you don't consider that you would be involved with, and especially in a larger disaster type situation that may be outside just physical security. If you're interested in being on my routine distribution list for training and exercise events, such as webinars that we offer, you don't necessarily you don't have to be from Region 8 to join those. They're open across the country for people to hop on those. We do a lot of webinars and things. If you email me there, I can add you to that distribution list. Send out about 2 emails a month with some upcoming trainings and opportunities, so keep that in mind if you're interested. I know we don't have a lot of time left, but if you have additional questions before you have to wrap things
So
up.
just a quick, this might be too specific, and that's fine, Tim. So do you have any, is there best practices regarding, we run a therapeutic school for kids who've been traumatized, and so we've done some of this work with them, but it's very difficult for our children. How often is there a best practice, and how often that you do these, like we do disaster drills quarterly in other areas, but how often would you go through this in a school setting with kids?
So the actual practice and drills
Yes.
related to potential incident?
Yes.
I don't necessarily have a timeline to do that. I mean, sometimes your drills, I don't know if they involve everybody when you drill. Is it all in, or you may have to conduct them more frequently to capture different shifts or different groups of people to make sure that they all get a chance to participate in and understand and plan that. So depending on your scheduling and how that's laid out and time of year, that could vary. But setting a timeline of quarterly or or something like that, if you can manage it. I know sometimes you could take a lot of time to put together and plan different types of events. But if you get a system in place, you have a template to build off of, that can make it a lot easier. It sounds like you already have an existing process, and that can help you to not be as time intensive when you're trying to plan and set up.
But the active shooter piece is difficult for our kids.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, for sure it is.
Yeah.
Tim, on that point, our chief of protective security for our region also has a list of, in her network, of some of the outreach you can do, connections you can make with psychological resources in her states that she oversees. So again, deferring back to our state advisors, one thing CISA can do is help make those connections, because we're often talking to different people across each of the sectors that we support for critical infrastructure, which includes schools and other institutions that are socially based. So it could be that one of our state advisors might have some insiders or connection that they could make with you through a network for that kind of psychological support.
Any other questions?
Tim, I appreciate the presentation today. My ministry is in Illinois, and we're in the health and human service field, and child welfare in particular is what I want to speak to. I chair, along with the DCFS director in Illinois, and I represent the private sector. We've unfortunately in the last 2 years have had some murders of staff in the field, and we've had a number of offices that's been shot up, including the director's office. Our legislators are rallying around with some legislation and dollars in the budget, and we're really identifying how can we create a much more systemic view of safety in our environment. And it's unique because we're not police, we're the helping agent, we're the social worker going in and trying to help. And at the same time, even my organization has been put in a position that's been very scary for us. I guess I'm asking, and to me, these are resources, and I'm trying to get a sense how we can leverage those and have a broader conversation in Illinois. Too many agencies are looking at just one piece or a couple pieces and aren't looking at systemically bigger. And I feel my role wearing that hat means to really be able to lift up resources for administrators like me to see this much broader and plan much broader. And I'm hopeful that I can reach out to you all and you can help connect me with people in Illinois that does your work, because we'd like to bring them into the state. We're working with the state police right now, body scanning and equipment. It's very expensive. The state's willing to buy those. You got some kind of lanyard that goes around the neck, you push it when you get out of your car, it tracks you, GPS system, you can push it for help. They're buying bulletproof vests for folks. It's just really starting to spin. And today's presentation is giving me the sense is we need to stop for a second and really pull it much higher and look at this in a planful way. And we're responding out of emotion. And again, when someone on your team gets murdered in the field, that is traumatic for the organization, and legislators have a tendency to be reactionary in their approach. So I'm hopeful that I can follow up with you all, and you can help point me to your colleagues in Illinois so we can bring them to the table in a more meaningful conversation.
Yes, I can for sure. Sorry to hear about the suffering that you had. I think getting you connected with our contacts is that they can work with the other agencies potentially involved. You already work with the state, but that would be helpful to be involved, Karen.
Region 5.
Yeah.
It's, so that's our Region 5, and like Tim said, he can put you in contact with our folks there. So they'll be familiar with that and hopefully have some ideas about elevation, like you're saying.
Thank you. I'll follow up. Thank you.
I know that there's some grants available out there. I don't know that this is necessarily your expertise, but can you speak to that a little? I think it's maybe important for this group to be aware of what could be available, maybe where to find the information.
Yeah, a lot of times starting with that local emergency management, and of course the state, they can help guide you on what's available for your specific types of circumstances. Kara, I don't know if you have more to offer there, but
I know that there are different grants. A lot of them are, we might review them, especially like the cybersecurity grants. We have state, local, territorial, and tribal grants that are available. You would apply through FEMA, we would look at them. But there's a grants.gov website, cannot remember it off the top of my head, but you should be able to Google that as well. And that can give you a list of grants that are available. And also working with your state offices. Does OEM comes through the state?
Yeah, so that emergency management contacts within the state, they have a pretty good understanding of those available programs and work to get those dollars allocated where it may be, depending on the grant and how it's distributed, maybe by county or each gets a certain amount, and depending on the type of grant, there's a lot of, that can be confusing for sure.
Would those grants also be eligible for state agencies like Department of Child Welfare?
They are, and it depends on what federal department you go through. So if you go through Department of Homeland Security, which is what this is under, then you'd be looking at something that we'd be doing, FEMA would oversee the grant, but we would look at it to approve it. But as you all are probably aware, the Department of Health and Human Services also has a lot of grants that come out for public health from CDC and NIH. That also, a lot of them will filter down through the state first and then go out from there. But it really depends on the grant, so it's worth getting on that website. And I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top.
Well, that's what I thought, but my team would be there. Yeah, we check it out for them this week. Yes.
Oh, okay, very good, yeah.
Other questions? I know we're about on time, and they have lunch and a nice event to wrap things up.
Thank you so much.
Hey, yeah, fuel, kids, help.